Academy? Yeah.
We seem to have a full house for something that I'm sure is going to generate a number of questions, so let's get started on time. We're very happy to welcome Joel Perriott today from the American Astronomical Society. Joel is, in fact, Dr. Joel Perriott. He got his start doing computational astrophysics at the University of Michigan with Joel Bregman.
Cooling flows.
Doing cooling flows in elliptical galaxies, yes.
I think I cited them a lot. I do. Yeah.
He went straight from there to the National Academy, as most graduate students getting their PhD immediately. But he was actually working at the National Academy for 4 years, and then moved to the Office of Management and Budget for 10 years. So at one point, he knew the secret key to open the vault where all the money is kept, but as I understand, they've changed the password. He then went to the American Astronomical Society as the Director of Public Policy, and then a few years after that added the title Deputy Executive Director. If you go to AAS meetings, you'll often see Joel wandering around. He's a great person to hit up for answers to questions or drink tickets, whichever is more important to you at the time.
Drink tickets at the reception. Yeah.
But he will be here today talking to us about exactly how does the Decadal survey matter to the rest of government. Thank you.
Thanks, Randall. This is a low resolution representation. I don't know why that is, but is there something I should be doing to make it high res?
Looks pretty good from here.
You need new glasses, Irving.
It might be his mirror, his screen, his display options.
Okay, so yeah, it's a little fuzzy. Okay, so to start about what the talk is not about, which is what is the Decadal survey in astronomy and astrophysics doing? What are they deciding? How are they going to make those decisions? All that. Mostly because I have no idea. There's town halls that Fiona and Rob are doing. There's a webinar that they have. Yeah, I don't know why it's all out of focus. There's a webinar that they're doing next week. I'm sure if you just go to the Astro 2020 website, you can find that. Or, and I'm naming all of the local people, not MIT, of course, but I'm naming all the local people that you can. Are you going to find out why it's low resolution? Great.
I think it's the display settings.
This didn't happen to me at lunch. What's that?
Is it true about the drink tickets?
Yes.
Because you can go downstairs after the closing and get a beer for free here.
But we have, we give special recognition to volunteer leaders. So if you're like Randall and you do something for us, then you're more likely to get drink tickets. So,
It's all blocky.
It's actually higher resolution before you go into presenter mode.
it worked at lunch. I don't know why it's not.
There you go.
Hey, ooh.
I think it's the adapter.
Oh, all right. So I just won't touch anything. Okay. There we go. Okay, now
It's
we
also
can,
clear now.
now we can clearly see who around here you're supposed to bother. I think everybody's on a panel, either a science panel or a program prioritization panel. Nancy said, I'm not the chair, I don't know. So, but they do know more than I do. Or you could come to Hawaii and hear a town hall in January. So I used to, as Randall said, I worked at the National Academy of Sciences National Research Council when I first got out of grad school, so I know a lot of this stuff. So why, when they're working, can't they talk to you? Why can they have meetings in private and render decisions? It's because in 1997, they were going to have this ability to do that removed, and they got into law a special exemption from the FACA, quote-unquote, Federal Advisory Committee Act, that allows them to have private meetings if the only ones in the room are members of the committee, consultants, or staff. So that's why they can have certain parts of the meeting private, certain parts open, where they're hearing external, non-member, non-consultant presentations, and then close the meeting again. So it's part of the deliberative process. I'm in favor of it because there's lots of discussions that people are willing to have in private that they wouldn't have in a public meeting that everyone was zoomed into. But that's just wanted to let you know that's why there's not much information flowing out. So what is the talk about? It's the stuff I know more about, which is why do we do it, and how is it used, and what might be coming up next. I don't know, is Kick cereal still made? It's a thing from when I was a kid. I'm starting to, I say things now when I give talks and I realize I'm getting old because the younger people don't laugh. So this is the time-tested bit. Starting in 1964, that was all ground-based. And you can see, shockingly, a decadal survey happens roughly every 10 years. This was just astronomy and astrophysics. And Marcia Reiki did a presentation to a workshop last fall where she laid out a lot of this. And I've got a link to it in the next slide, where she kind of goes through what were, in her opinion, the main things that resulted from each one of the surveys. And they're known largely by the chair. So people talk about the field report. Rather than saying astronomy and astrophysics for the 1980s, they'll just say the field report said X or Y. Here's the rest. I added, because I know that there's some radio astronomers around, and Marcia had not included ALMA and had not, for solar, included DKIST in her list. But these are her slides. So I don't expect you all to write down that URL, but you can Google probably her and decadal survey and find it. So you can see a lot of things coming out of these, and that's why the community has found them to be useful. They've been imitated. Probably a discipline that's extremely close to us in terms of infrastructure and how it thinks about itself is oceanography. And they've even started doing this. This is Earth Science at NASA, and that's well, it used to be science on the space station, but life and physical sciences research. For the planetary and helio folks in the room, here are the two most recent decadal surveys from those subdisciplines. The AAS advocates for all this stuff, so I have to pay attention to what's in all these surveys. But right now I'm going to focus on astronomy and astrophysics because that's happening right now. So you know that you've been doing something a long time when you then have a survey of surveys. So Alan Dressler chaired this committee back in 2014, and basically a lot of what I'm going to say today and that we're going to discuss, they talked about and talk about in this report. So if you really want to know more about lessons learned and what's happened in each one of the different areas, I highly recommend this report to you. I don't usually recommend just sitting down and reading a National Academy's report, but on this particular subject, this is an interesting one. And I should say that I'm hoping we can have a bit of a discussion because I'm not the world's expert here. We have a lot of people in the room that I can eyeball that know a lot about how projects happened, how the surveys have or have not worked in their opinion. So I hope that you'll chime in. I'm going to take a little dig at DOE for a minute just because I can't help it. So why hasn't physics done this? So what you hear from physicists is, well, we're too big and complex. You guys are simple, small little field, and that's why you can do this prioritization. Now, they do decadal surveys, but they're all science-focused. So I'm going to be a cynic for a minute and tell you why I think physics doesn't do it. That's because DOE doesn't want the National Academies in their business, really, for prioritizing things. NASA and NSF understand the benefits, but DOE likes to do their own prioritization. Even though DOE is paying for part of this decadal survey and the last one, they have a hard time meshing. And if you see a presentation by somebody from DOE at a decadal survey meeting, they're going to talk about something called the P5, which is under their advisory committee structure, HEPAP, High Energy Physics Advisory Panel, and P5 is a prioritization panel, and that's how they set priorities for high energy physics to include cosmic frontiers, which is the piece that our discipline cares about in particular. So, and in fact, one of these here on the left, so the material research, so they do these, but you'll see that's mostly focused on science. The other part of the KICS serial is policymaker approved. And this is the real reason that the discipline continues to do it. Agencies view these both offensively and defensively. If a project in there is being assailed by someone, they have a shield, and that happens quite a bit. And it helps them advocate for more resources. Folks at the White House, these are a bunch of OMB's Office of Management and Budget. That's where I used to be. Office of Science and Technology Policy. And then ones that our community doesn't talk about that much, but we should because they're super important in normal White Houses, is the Domestic Policy Council, the National Economic Council, and the National Security Council. They all, except for OMB, want to spend more money. They want lots of stuff in the State of the Union. They want to go on initiatives, and it's OMB that's usually reining everyone in. So you're sort of, you're Debbie Downer around. It kind of stinks, but it's part of the job. And then Congress. Most of the people in Congress who care about these are the ones who serve on committees and the committee staff, appropriations committees, the authorization committees. And those staff, if you go in to meet with them, are going to know everything about the decadal surveys. They're going to understand them. Some individual offices get involved, but most offices that you would go in to talk to about this aren't going to know boo about the decadal survey. Congress likes it so much that they wrote the need for at least NASA to do them into law. So on the left is from a 2008 NASA authorization where they say you need to do these things. We want independent cost estimates. And that you should make sure that you're watching cost and schedule and go back to the Academy if there are any big changes. The 2010 NASA authorization, they went and said, well, this was a dig at OMB, I think, but that you should take into account the decadal surveys when you're submitting budget requests. So that's just my example of showing you that Congress cares a lot about this stuff. I could have pulled out report language from appropriations bills and reports. So one of those things is the reason, and this is an eye chart, you do not need to read this, that if you look in each annual NSF budget proposal, each division has to have a section that explains how they evaluate themselves against the decadal survey recommendations. So you'll see one of these, this is astrophysics from the 2020 budget, but you'll see the same for planetary science and heliophysics and earth science. So they have to report out how they think they're doing every year. The AAS, when we advocate for things, this is pretty much a stock paragraph that goes into every letter that we write to the Hill. It would have been when Christine was president, I'm sure that this paragraph appeared somewhere in the letters that were written. So you can see that right, and this is usually the second paragraph, right up front we're talking about the decadal surveys as setting us apart. So this is something I said a lot when I was at the White House Budget Office. They're a necessary but not sufficient condition. But why do staffers like them? Why do we encourage more and more of them in DC? Why is everyone imitating and emulating them? Because as a staffer, you don't want people coming in and bothering you all the time. And if they do, you want to be able to reach to the shelf. I'm old, I had paper reports. You want to reach on the shelf and pull out the list and say, okay, Mrs. or Mr. Advocate, where on this list are you? And if they're not on the list, you can stop paying attention and think about what you're going to make for dinner that night. So that's really important, because without that, without these, it's the Wild West, and it's whoever has the most connections and whoever happens to grab somebody's the last voice, say with the current president, whoever talks to the president last. Agency staff, when they come to present budgets to the White House, better have a darn good reason if they're doing something that's not in direct alignment with the priorities in the decadal surveys. And they actually do have good reasons, shockingly, that they would deviate from them. And we can talk about WFIRST as a good case study to come. And I will say, even though those parts are focused on the administration side and the executive branch side, really, if you want more money, Congress is going to be the place to do it. They like them, but they're not going to second guess the community's priorities. But it's really good if, say, the top priority is going to preferentially be built in some senator's home state, for example. That kind of helps you. And so Randall wanted me to spend a little bit of time on how decisions get made around the decadal surveys. At the White House, you're fairly immune from, say, the power of the AAS coming in to convince you to fund some particular thing. So the main influence is from those other White House offices, much better place to go in. OMB's not going to do much other than making sure that you're doing what's on the list. The closer you are to the Oval Office, the more likely you are to roll the bean counters during the budget process. The downside for NASA and NSF being independent agencies is they don't have direct lines to the president. So cabinet secretaries can easily do things that NASA and NSF struggle to do. In Congress is much, well, it's easier to understand how decisions get made. There's many more points of influence. every member has particular interests or priorities that they want to get done. The leadership in Congress has priorities. So, for example, astrophysics did really well in the House bill for FY20 because Steny Hoyer, Mr. Hoyer, is in Maryland and he's the majority leader in the House. So that person just calls up whoever is writing the bill in the House and says, you're going to do X, and it happens because they're in leadership. There's appropriation cardinals, each one of these subcommittees, the Appropriations Committee. Their power has been greatly reduced over the years because the leadership in both the House and the Senate has consolidated control over most decisions, mostly because all the normal processes are broken. So at the end of the day, it's really the leaders in the room making decisions. And I don't know why I put this on here. Powerful interest groups get the key vote bills. The AAS is not a powerful interest group for the purposes of key voting. That would be more like the NRA, where if they key vote something, members of Congress pay great attention.
Can you explain just a little bit more what key votes mean?
Key vote is that's where some organization decides this bill or this series of bills are very important to us. So we're going to issue a press release that says we are key voting the following bills. And then they're going to track each member of Congress that's voting yes or no on that. And then they're going to email those lists to their membership and say you either praise or criticize all of these people. So members of Congress are very, if you have the oomph, they're going to be very careful about the keys, just like these are the key decisions that we're watching. So now I'm going to tell you something that I never would have told you if I was still at OMB. It's not really about total project cost. It's more about cash flow. So I stole this slide from Allison Bardo from Ball Aerospace was talking about in-space assembly. And whether you like or think in-space assembly is realistic or not, the bottom line is anything that you can do to flatten a cost curve, in this case they're saying by having two separate launches, is very appealing to folks at OMB. Sure, the integrated cost is going to be higher, but when you only have small amounts of money give and take from one year to the next, and you're trying to keep the whole government in some wedge, you really are looking for things that are easier to swallow, and thus having a flat cost curve is particularly appealing. Now, if I was still at OMB, I would have never shown this and say, that's too expensive. Right? I don't need to say LUVOIR to people in the room, do I? Or maybe I do. But I think this is an appealing path, frankly, and I think the LUVOIR folks would agree that, distant future, this is the way to be doing big mirrors, and it's appealing for multiple reasons. So within our own community, let's talk a little bit about dissenting voices. People thinking that we're selecting Christmas trees, putting everything on them, all the bells and whistles, so we can benefit the whole community. And then what happens is James Webb, Hubble, all, I don't know, would you put Chandra on there? No, of course not. So we've been in some time, I think, as a community in this argument on, it's either got to be flagships, which are the big strategic missions, or probes. And I think that's getting us too much into a shooting inward mentality. I think it has to be both and. Now, how that all works out, I can't tell you, but there are a lot of people that I've talked to, and I'm going to show a video in a minute, who worry that if we only do flagships, there's not going to be money left for anything else. Another criticism, are we involving enough people from across the community to make the best decisions? Is it a bunch of senior people sitting in a room making decisions that the early career people in the discipline are going to have to execute whether they think it's the right thing to do or not? And both of these issues played out at a hearing last year. So I think I have time to play this. It's a short video clip, and it's with one of your senators, so you should be supportive of that. Not the one running for president. Okay. So I think it'll be okay because it's pretty bright. So here's the title of the hearing. So it was all about the search for life. This is toward the very end of the hearing.
There are many missions. Are you satisfied with the prioritization process that they have at NASA?
Hold on,
I think it's a question worth
louder.
asking to everybody. We have the decadal surveys, but I
I'm
think
going to start with you,
Okay.
and then
I
I'm
was
going
gonna give
to
it
go
to my
down
colleague.
the
Let's
rest of
start it
them.
again.
Is to continually do that, to really
so it's definitely the way forward.
Yeah, hold your
I think
mic.
the ecosystem of potential partners has gotten much bigger. It's not just the aerospace companies, but there's areas like robotics. 20 years ago, I suspect that NASA represented a significant fraction of all work in robotics. Today, it's a tiny fraction, with enormous amounts money going to things like self-driving cars and, of course, things in factories. And I think there's an opportunity for NASA, I know they're doing their best to take advantage of this, to partner not only with the Boeings and
We'll
the
skip David for a
SpaceXs,
minute
but
here.
We only have so much money.
All right, so he's
And
wants
that,
to
to
ask
me,
about.
certainly hinges around things like building the next giant telescopes, focusing on making sure we understand this planet, and getting humans to Mars.
Ellen Stofan was used to be the
Thank you,
chief
Senator
scientist
Markey.
at NASA.
Dr. Seeger, I want to talk about NASA's mission prioritization process. We only have so much money. There are many missions. Are you satisfied with the prioritization process that they have at
Well,
NASA?
I think it's a question worth asking to everybody. We have the decadal surveys, but I
I'm
think
going to start with you,
Okay.
and then
I
I'm
was
going
gonna
to
give
go
it to my
down the
colleague.
rest of them.
Okay.
But because you're from Massachusetts, I thought I'd start with you. But I do want to hear from each of the rest of the witnesses as well.
Sure. Well, you've heard many times how the witnesses always go back to the decadal survey. And it's kind of this structure that we're, let's say, forced to abide by. But I want to say that any institution, any kind of structure that's been around for more than half a century, I think it should be reviewed to see if it's still effective. Maybe it has been reviewed already, but I think it's really time to take a better look
So
at
as
it.
David's saying,
I think there's
it's been
many areas,
reviewed, Sarah.
room for improvement there, which I won't go into now.
Okay, well, why don't you give us one example of improvement?
Sure, I'll give you one because in many areas of space science, so we have the James Webb Space Telescope. It's a good example, as is WFIRST and other missions, that the whole community feels that if they don't have one mission that the entire community buys into, that it will never get selected by the decadal survey. So what this means is that the community wants to put forward missions that are very complicated, like it had 10 new technologies. And the question is, are we at a place like of maturity in space technology now where we should have more focused missions that are also big missions, but not try to do everything in one place? And we can't really do that in the current formulation of the survey. We also had this other comment about the younger people not knowing about, well, sometimes the younger people know more. They're the first to use, Instagram and like do new things. But also the way that the hierarchy of the survey is, the top panel is like senior esteemed people who don't necessarily wouldn't necessarily vote the same way the new generation would.
Right. And again, the kid who came up with Instagram is a high school kid from Hopkinton, Massachusetts.
So he had to get that in. If you've ever watched hearings, you know that members of Congress need to constantly refer to their home state or district. So I just wanted to show that to say, I mean, Sarah obviously has a very, and then most people in the discipline who know what she's working on know where she's going here. But when things like that get said in Congress, people tend to remember those things. And those are real valid, and if we had continued to play that, Thomas Abrukin, who is the head of Science Mission Directorate at NASA, would have agreed with the need for a diversity of views to make better decisions. See, I shouldn't have left the... she would have agreed with, or he agreed with that, and so did the other folks, the need for that. But they also think that that survey of surveys helped it remain. Hooray, okay. So one of the things that she alluded to there was the big missions and how long they take. So this is a chart that Paul Hertz, who runs astrophysics at NASA, shows a lot, not with these bits, but to show the main flagship mission that came out of each one of the decadals. So I just wrote down launch date and how many years from the release of the decadal. Obviously, there was a lot of work prior to these dates of the ideas being formulated and proposed and reproposed, but just the number of years from release of the survey to launch. And this is one of the big criticisms at OMB and elsewhere about flagships. Do you really want a flagship? Is this really what you want? And Paul Hertz has taken this on as he's looked at guidance for the next decadal survey, and this is his expectation for how much, quote-unquote, free energy or budget headroom he has in the decade that the survey will be exploring. So he does a bunch of basic extrapolations and decides that he has somewhere between $5 and say $7 billion in a decade to spend on a flagship mission. So that's why I think they probably did a lot of work asking whether missions could be de-scoped down to fit in that particular box or not. I talked a lot about the lessons learned, this report that the Space Studies Board did. Again, that's just on the space science piece of it, not so much with NSF. This particular decadal survey got some early, I think, foundation money to do a workshop last year with early career people to try to start engaging them in the discussions. And then there's an ongoing lesson learned with WFIRST. And we're in this weird situation with WFIRST where the White House is going to continue to propose to cancel it. And at least this White House, and the Congress is going to continue to add it back in. And trying to manage that within NASA is really difficult and inefficient. So everyone has their story about WFIRST, that it's the Franken project that the committee put together in 2010. But I mentioned that that there's a reason for why it's become what it is. If we were to go back and look at all the stages WFIRST passed through, from release of the survey to now, each time there was some change, NASA dutifully went back to the Academy and said, what do you think about this? Is the science still compelling? So they've got a clear roadmap of how they got from here to the current WFIRST. And each one of those steps, you can look at and you can disagree or not, but there's a logic in how they got to where they are with that mission. Is it going to happen or not? I think we still don't know. I think Congress, like I said, will continue to add it back in, but there's this jeopardy with the new Decadal survey coming out on what they might say or not say about the project. That's going to be a huge gap. Speaking of the time lag, a huge gap for the field if WFIRST is canceled. And let me talk a little bit about the diversity of voices view. There's also a sense in Washington sometimes that all they're hearing from is the Research One universities on the coasts, and that you're expecting all of the non-Research One folks across the country and then the people who aren't on the coast to be supportive of a vision that was largely generated by people on committees who were all from R1 universities. So I think this survey's tried hard to recruit those people. The rumors I've heard is most of the people they were trying to recruit for the science and program prioritization panels, who may have been from liberal arts colleges or something like that, said no, too busy, teaching load's too high, I can't do that. So a few of them were willing to be on the State of the Profession panel. More of them said yes to that, but on the science and program prioritization panels, they had a really difficult time. So that's one of those things that when the survey's out and people like or don't like it, they'll just criticize the membership. They won't know any of that backstory. So it's something that I think the chairs of the co-chairs are going to have to work on when the report comes out. And speaking of co-chairs, I wanted to talk a little bit about the role they play after the survey comes out. So, is everyone in the room? So this is John Bacall, for people who may not know. There's a reason that the AAS has a postdoctoral policy fellowship named after John. I came to DC in 1998 and knew fresh out of grad school and got to meet John. This is, quite a while after his survey had come out. He was still, now it's easier from Princeton, he was still taking the train down and meeting with staff every month. Here's what's going on. And he had a relationship with all the key staffers. They knew he would come in and they trusted his views, they trusted what he was going to say. He wasn't trying to sell them a bill of goods, but he maintained those relationships regularly. So I got to know him, and that's, the model for how I think things get sold well. Now, in the McKee-Taylor report, the idea was Chris is going to do, that's the one I supported, Chris is going to do all the work, get the thing done, and then Joe, the Nobel laureate, will come down from Princeton, same train as John took. And I think, frankly, Joe was willing to do it, but nobody engaged him to come do that. And the way the funding works at the National Academy of Sciences, there's no money, after the survey's done to pay people to do those things. So the Academy tends to just drop reports and, hope that it goes well. I wasn't at the AAS at the time. I think if you were going to ask Roger Blanford lessons learned from the survey that he chaired, the most recent one, he would say, he really wanted to come do this, but there were no resources to help make that possible. And he puts a lot of the blame at the feet of AAS in that regard. I think we have a pretty, I just work at the AAS, I don't vote on anything. But I would say from what I've heard from the current AAS board, there's a desire to be more supportive of the next co-chairs after the survey comes out to identify a budget line or something to help fund staff time and travel to support them in advocating deep into the next survey. That's not to say that's going to, make it all better or make it sell better, but we have a commitment at the AAS, I think, to help work on that. Still on the advocacy theme, so when at the AAS, I have a frustration with this, and I certainly had one when I worked at OMB. This is an example of the Planetary Society advocating for a telecommunications orbiter around Mars and actually getting some language into an appropriations bill. So in order to do that, they would say to you, well, it's in the survey. Well, it looks like it's in Appendix C. This isn't even it, and we'll just take this little piece, communications, and we'll say, we need to do this. We'll do a study, it'll be fine, and then we'll go advocate. So staff know that this happens, and they're careful about it, and they will actually go look and see, what do you mean, where in the report? It's not in the list. It's not in the list. It may be in some vignette in an appendix on page 582, but it's not on the main list. But people still do this. If there's some vignette, they'll say, well, it's in the survey. And that's dangerous for the credibility of the community when people do that. Okay, we'll move up to current day. What's the outlook for the fall of 2020? So the survey is expected to come out somewhere at the end of next calendar year. The presidential campaigns look for ideas. I promise you they're not looking for astronomy ideas, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try once it's a little bit clearer who the various candidates are going to be. I said this at lunch, I think there's one who happens to live down the road, you may know, who's running for president. Most of the ideas that are going to come out are going to be things with clear relationships to industry, advanced manufacturing, quantum computing, curing diseases. So, whether timing the survey to come out right then is a net benefit or not is hard to know. I think to the degree if we have a new president, you have a lot of new people around, it's a better chance than otherwise to come out then. I don't think we should time things, try to be too precise, because that's just not how things work. But you never know. There might be some big geopolitical issue at hand. And these are the geopolitical things are the things that the political people, at least in my experience at the White House, care about. When I was at the Academy, I staffed a study about the future of particle physics. And this is when there was a big push for the International Linear Collider. And the chair of it was Harold Shapiro, who'd been the president of Princeton, an economist. And he had a couple of members of the committee come in with him to speak to the political people at OMB, and they let the scientists talk about the project and how important it is to learn this and that. And I could see my political boss kind of nodding. And he finally looked at Harold and said, why? I don't get it. Why should we do this? And Harold said, because we're a great country, and once in a while we have to do hard stuff. And that was it. And you could see that my political boss is like, that makes sense. That's washing over me. I get that. But, things about finding, different states of matter, don't weigh the day. So maybe there's some geopolitical reason that this will be important. I don't know. We were saying at the at the lunch talk, it probably would have helped if the Chinese rover drove over the U.S. flag on the moon. I mean, that would be, maybe tons of money would flow into space science because of that. I don't know. If the president wins re-election, I think you've got the same R&D priorities we currently have. Frankly, I think the Democrats' priorities are going to look a heck of a lot like President Obama's priorities, which looked a heck of a lot like President Clinton's priorities. So, again, maybe there's room, but I think that's sort of where we're at. And one of the things that's been topic of discussion around is whether maybe the thing we should be working on is all get together and sell a Great Observatories program again. I think it's an appealing idea. Whether it works or not, I don't know. But from an OMB standpoint, and anybody in D.C., and I saw this in lots of communities, if you have different people who are leaders in the community coming in to talk to you, and they're saying different things, not even necessarily critical things about the other priorities in the discipline, but if they're just saying different things, that whole message nets to zero. So they might as well not have come in. So the only way that we're going to get to be able to build the big, new, exciting things that are going to be recommended in this survey is if the whole community stands together and says the same stuff. So that means everyone has to believe in the process. Everyone has to at least grudgingly acknowledge the outcome of the survey, and then be supportive of it as it comes out. So on that, is that depressing or kumbaya? That's happy. On that note, I will stop.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, so we have time for questions, discussions. Probably keep the polemics to a minimum, but anyone? Charles.
I was trying to decide which of my many questions to ask. Let's talk a little bit about JWST, because it's far enough along that it doesn't really matter what we say anymore. But for a considerable period of time, it's in the report. JWST is in the report. It was brought out over and over again. And by the time a decade had passed, it was nothing like what was in the original damn report. It was 3 to 5 to ultimately 10 times as expensive. It was smaller. But that rhetoric, it's in the report, seems to be used very liberally and generously on necessity. So just how critical is the thinking on the part of these staffers? Or do they just go and see, is there a big chapter that talks about a mid-infrared telescope in space?
Well, the report is going to be more impactful in starting something, getting that new start. But just like I said, you could take the W-First example and look at all. I remember, I staffed one of these things when the mirror got reduced. And they asked for a report from the Academy. Is the science still compelling, even with a mirror, a smaller mirror? Yes. So, on the science side, NASA did all the right things. But it was the top recommendation, and I would say that it's easier when it's the top recommendation for something to sustain and continue to be referenced as a top priority for the discipline. So in that case, it's in the report is legitimate versus it's in some appendix mentioned somewhere as something we might do someday, and claiming that that's enough of a lineage to get a new start. But I don't want to underplay the hangover that is JWST. Certainly my old boss at OMB is very negative on flagships because of JWST. People in town, even other advocacy people in town I've run into, give me grief about JWST cost growth. So it is a present issue. of people making decisions in DC, no doubt. So anytime I hear that, you know, there's more schedule slippage, I get nervous because it's not done yet.
Further? What else? Harvey.
So, a lot of projects do get de-scoped because of either cost growth or reduction of available funding. W first a little bit different because it had at least two major increases after the Decadal. It was recommended as, you know, almost ready to go and reasonably low cost, and then the free but larger optic was added and cost screwed, and then the coronagraph was added. Even if it's an experiment, it still costs to build it and use it. And if it really works, it will cost even more to use it because people will find it very useful. So that seems to be an anomaly compared to what happens to most programs.
Well, okay, here's an interesting. So if you have a committee at the Academy that's charged with evaluating science, in the case of these projects, the standing committee at the Academy is called the Committee on Astronomy and Astrophysics. And you go to that committee anytime there's one of these tweaks. And in this case, you present to them, hey, we've got this opportunity. Is the science good? They're going to say the science is great. That doesn't mean that NASA, I don't think you ask a bunch, well, no offense, I don't think you ask a bunch of academics, you know, is this project plan right? Do we understand all the costs? You know, the CA gets asked, is the science good? And yea, verily, go forth. Yes, the science is good. So it's a tough, what the right way to go is. I mean, Kathy's back here, she's probably got all the bruises from those encounters. So, yeah, it does go both ways.
Kathy, do you have?
I did. It's just a naive, practical question. Let's imagine I'm one of those future, you know, PIs maybe, or maybe a pro or something. The smart thing to do, supposedly, would be to give the optimum development schedule, cheapest budget, quick delivery, da-da. O&B would immediately prefer me to double the costs, spread it out, which is a delay and an overrun, but much more palatable. What's the right thing to do in practical sense?
I think for an individual probe in that case, in the way that budgets are decided, you know, OMB is going to say, you, Paul Hertz, have a probe line, and that's how much money you get. And we're not going to give you more money if one of them goes off or something. You're just going to have to kick the can on all the future ones. So in the case of that, you know, they're not going to get really in the weeds on things that are competitively selected. Where OMB gets out its microscope is on these strategic missions, and they feel...
It's not PI driven, so in that case, though, if I wanted to advance things, or if I wanted to, you know, personally, what might be your best advice? Come in with the cheapest budget, fastest delivery, but it's going to look bad.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying, right?
Yeah, I hear what you're
It's just
saying.
practical, that's all.
We'll take a firm example from NSF. We haven't talked enough about NSF. LSST. So I was at OMB when LSST got, at least from the OMB side, a new start. And I didn't pay, you know, after that, it was going forth. It was a great project. Decadal loved it. Fine. And then I didn't pay much more attention. I was doing other stuff. I left it and came to the AAS. Ended up sitting on as a consultant to a ground-based OIR study. And I hadn't heard anything about LSST for years, and I heard a presentation from Steve Kahn on it, and how they weren't going to have any money for L3 data products from LSST, now this development. And I went through the roof. So are you kidding me? Why did that happen? They said because the proponents at LSST Corp were worried about proposing something bigger. What people don't understand is there's zero difference between asking for $1 and asking for $1 billion. You get the decision. And whether it's 950, whether in the case of LSST, they could have asked for $700 million. And nobody's going to, the hard part's getting the yes. And the rest of it just sort of rolls and happens. It's reality.
Yeah.
So I hear two voices among the community. One is, we take our best guess about what the real budget wedge is, and we're told what the budget wedge is, and we're really smart about working within that wedge. And then the other approach is, that we use the Decadal to lift the ceiling, that this is an opportunity to go out, and I think on the ground with NSF, there's an obvious, very exciting thing that might be well beyond any reasonable budget wedge. And in space, there's an obvious, very exciting thing, or several things, that are well beyond any reasonable budget wedge. So are those people crazy, or is it reasonable to look at the Decadal survey as an opportunity to really lift our aspirations financially with NSF and NASA, but ultimately with Congress?
Well, NSF is an interesting case. You have, if I set aside the CMB for a little while, you've got a couple $1 billion between the two 30-meter telescopes, and then another $2 billion for next generation VLA. So spending $4 billion out of an MREFC account that's, historically been around $200 million. For example. I mean, I may have just pulled that out of the air. I don't know. NSF right now, they're thinking hard about how the MREFC account should be looked at in the future. There's a lot of groups that are working on, how can we make NSF more interested in, being more strategic.
But this is a discussion, right? So what I'm saying is, yes, NSF can move money around, but there's only so much money. It's Congress that would change.
But NSF is, I'm now convinced, having done this stuff, that the only way the NSF budget gets a big increase is to do big lumpy things,
right,
like these projects. Because what's happening right now, and when I was at OMB doing it, it's science by the pound. Just turn that grant machine.
Is it possible to get a significant increase with NSF? Is that a reasonable thing?
Sure. That's possible. You have to, that's something that, we're talking about these numbers, but, if they're phased, it's not that much more money. And that's something you could probably convince a new administration of. Right now you've got an astronomer running the place, but France's term ends in March. You got Jim Oldestad,
But NSF doesn't advocate. So how does that, do we have to
The managing organizations and the universities advocate for that.
to Congress?
Yeah.
And Congress cuts them.
The hard part is getting it so it doesn't look like just the greedy astronomers. So can you get the physicists on board to advocate for this? Can you get the oceanographers on board to say we really need a fundamentally different way of budgeting big projects at NSF? And I think, I'm hopeful that something can happen there. If all these communities that are the big project communities at NSF are coming that way. It's still culturally just, 250K at a time agency. And that's the astronomer's problem. But I think there is room if there's enough of people of the disciplines that care about big projects there. I think there's room to actually have a serious growth in it. Because otherwise, right now, it's just, the arguments are terrible.
Yes.
But we just want to do more science. Well, how much more science? So I'm hopeful on the NSF side.
Can I make a brief comment on this chart while it's up?
Sure.
So Paul, this isn't your chart, it's Paul Hertz's. And, you know, it could be somewhat problematic in that it looks like there's two different wedges the way it's shown, but all those different there, it's not real growth, it's just inflation. So if the emissions are costed in FY $20, which is what most people submitted, and there's a $5 billion decade without, you know, per decade without inflation, that's a certain wedge. If inflation is 1 or 2%, and the curves grow by that amount, the wedge grows, but everything goes up by the same 1 or 2%. So those are really one and the same. And what the panel will need to look at is an actual real increase and not get caught up in whether there's a 1 or 2% inflation.
Yeah, I would hope that they're not differentiating at that level. And, you know, you just never know. I couldn't, when I first came to AAS, Planetary had this huge cut. Okay, they had just gotten whacked. I never would have believed if you told me that they were going to double their budget in just a few years. Right? And that's Mr. Culberson having a particular interest in that field, and every time there was one of these budget deals, he would, you know, scrape some of that away, put it in NASA, and it went to Planetary. So it's, you know, yeah, you could. I would hope that the survey committee looks at scenarios that are more ambitious than Paul's inflationary one.
Okay, so Roseanne?
Just had a question about the goals that we look for from the Decadal survey. So, you know, we talk about the missions that are recommended, but there's also an important question about how does the science actually get done? So you said something interesting a little while ago about LSST. They could have asked for a lot more from the perspective that you were considering it. But as I understand it right now, LSST does not have a pot of money that would come available for people to analyze the data, unless they are. Just like you couldn't get people from liberal arts colleges and smaller places to come and do the work of the Decadal survey, they're also not available to just analyze scientific data without any return.
They're doing okay on the DOE side, preparing for the dark energy mission. The problem is, you know, Elon Musk is launching satellites that are going to. It turns out that the satellite constellations have ghosting in the CCDs that's going to make it look like weak lensing, but so they're going to lose about 10% minimum of the survey to that.
But I guess what I was trying to get at was putting in a pot of money for actually having the science done.
Yeah, they should have done that.
But it's that way for astronomy and for most of these missions as well, because you rely on geo programs and things like that.
Sure, you're saying can NSF do the NASA model?
Can it do a NASA model? And really, I think we probably need to consider the NASA model as well.
Oceanography does it. I think it's largely a cultural thing for astronomy at NSF. And, you know, as they were preparing to answer the last decadal's request for a mid-scale program, all these other programs got killed off. University Radio Observatories, TSIP, I could go down the acronym list of small programs that got eliminated to do that. So in that environment, when you're shutting down programs and observatories and you're consolidating all these little programs to try and even start some little wedge, to go to them and say, well, you need to carve out money as a geo program for all of your facilities, they're just not going to know how to do that. It's just beyond, you know, there's just no free energy there. The division directors at NSF have a lot of control over their little pot of money, but zero control over the top line number for their division. Even their bosses have no control over how much money they get. So it's very, you know, for an egalitarian agency, the decision making is very focused there. But they could do it. Oceanography doesn't.
It's 5 o'clock, but I have good news. The speaker will be coming to Oktoberfest for a little while. So if you'd like to buy him a beer and ask another question, you'll be able to. But let's thank him again for coming up with